Hey everybody, it's Mike here from the WeWrench shop. In episode 22, I'm going to disassemble, inspect, and rebuild the oil pump in the 1992 BMW E34 M5 restoration project. To be honest, this whole part of the build took me by surprise because the oil pump is very much the heart of the engine. If you lose oil pressure, catastrophic damage occurs, and I have a lot of time and money into this build. So replacing the oil pump with a brand new unit would really help me sleep at night. However, there are none of these oil pumps anywhere in the world, so rebuilding is the only option. First thing I did was gather as much information about this pump as possible. A positive sign is that this pump is shared amongst all the M30 engine variants, including the M5. All the individual internal parts are available, except for the front housing. So I literally ordered one of everything, and after a few weeks, the parts arrived from Germany. First step was to disassemble the pump by removing 6 10mm bolts that hold the front and rear housings together. And now with the pump apart, we can get into the theory of operation, so we better understand what steps will be taken to restore it. Oil pumps are actually very simple devices and mirror generic pumps used in hydraulic applications. The oil is pulled from the sump through the pickup, and as the rotors turn, a gap opens between the interlock teeth, causing a suction that pulls oil between the rotors on that side. When they are turned to the other side, the teeth begin to interlock again, creating flow, which then forces the fluid out the other side. There are 2 control mechanisms within the pump as well. The first controls the pump pressure with a piston and a calibrated spring. In the rear housing sits the second control mechanism. This is the oil pressure relief assembly, and it works in a similar fashion. The pump pressure acts on a piston backed by a spring, and if the pressure exceeds 114 psi, the piston opens and dumps oil back into the sump. Since I ordered a new rear housing, all these components will come in there pre-installed, so there's no need to worry about it. Now let's inspect the oil pump components for wear. As you saw earlier, the pump consists of an inner and outer rotor that spin in a housing to create flow. These are the main wear components of the pump. You can see these striations on the outer rotor surface and the pits on the inner rotor. Although it looks bad, this type of wear is considered typical and not catastrophic. Now the housing also shows signs of typical wear on the bore and face. There's also an intermediate plate that is sandwiched in between the front and rear housing. Again, this looks like it's worn tremendously, but the surfaces you're seeing are just polished. The plate itself is smooth throughout, and none of these surfaces get caught on a fingernail. Again, this is typical, but this part will get replaced too because it's cheap. The pump is torn down and inspected, so the plan is to replace the internals and correct the housing surface by removing the striations. But here's the problem. There are critical clearances inside of a G-rotor pump, and you can't just remove material without ramifications. So these critical clearances are what we're going to discuss next. First measurement to check is rotor to body clearance. To do this, start with a straight edge across the pump body. I'm using a snap-on machinist straight edge that is ground to within 2/10 flatness for every 12 inches of length. And on 2 sides, you want to insert your feeler gauge until you get some drag. Then try with the next size up, and if that won't go, you know the clearance is somewhere in between those 2 measurements. Next, we're going to check rotor to lobe clearance. This is a very critical clearance because this is where the oil seal occurs internally between the suction and the flow side of the pump. You want to rotate the pump until the inner and outer gear lobes are opposite to one another and then measure that clearance with a feeler gauge. Next, we're going to check outer rotor to housing clearance. For this measurement, I used my dial bore gauge and I zeroed it to the diameter of the new rotor. So when I measured the housing diameter, the reading on the dial bore gauge shows the clearance between the two. An acceptable range here is 0.02 of an inch to 0.06 of an inch. And since we are measuring 2.5 thousandths, I know I can take a few thousandths of an inch off the outer housing without any issues. I took 400 grit paper and proceeded to carefully sand out the striations in the bore and the housing. I had to use various tools to be able to sand to the edges and get even coverage. I did the same thing on the inner face of the housing. I just went over it slowly with 400 grit and created a nice smooth, even surface free of scoring or burrs. After that, I went back over the bore wear surfaces with 1000 grit to produce a smooth finish. I wasn't sure of what kind of surface finish these pumps come with when they are brand new, but I figured I should treat it like an interference bearing journal, where the smoother the better. Next, I polished up the control piston bore and the shaft housing and remeasured. 2.8 thousandths is what the bore measures to after performing the necessary corrections. Standard body clearance of a G-rotor pump can be between 2 and 6 thousandths. so taking off 3/10 won't keep me up at night. After re-verifying the correct clearances, I used assembly lube to reassemble the components. First the rotors, then the pressure control piston and spring. I mated the rebuilt front housing with the brand new rear housing, torqued the bolts, and it is ready to go.